On this Thursday night, pandemic projections this fall. The potential surge of illnesses beyond COVID.
We can expect this to ebb and flow.
As Canada moves the needle on fighting the Omicron variant. Shoddy aid for Ukraine's troops.
It's going to be used, it more likely will be shot at. So, I mean, this is life depending.
The problematic products traced back to Canada. A Global News exclusive. The UN's long-delayed report on how China treated Uyghur Muslims. The backlash from both Beijing and activists. And 5 decades since one of Montreal's worst tragedies.
People were falling from the second floor.
The haunting memories at the Bluebird Cafe fire.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Farah Nasser.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. With cold and flu season just around the corner, there's a new weapon to fight emerging variants of COVID-19. Health Canada has approved this country's first bivalent vaccine. It's from Moderna. And what's different about this shot is it targets 2 strains. Half of its contents protect against the original coronavirus, while the other targets the Omicron variant. Now, the most common subvariants in Canada are the offspring of Omicron. The shot will be delivered in 50 microgram doses. The new public health guidelines say any adult who needs a fall booster shot should get the new vaccine. 12 million doses are on order, and officials say there will be enough for all adults. But with many kids heading back to school this week, some without any COVID restrictions, there are concerns about the risks of another serious wave. Caryn Lieberman has our top story tonight.
After a 2-year pandemic pause, crowds returned to the Canadian National Exhibition, Toronto's iconic end-of-summer fair, and reminder, fall is around the corner.
And hopefully, we can bring back the normal from now on.
I think things have started to settle a bit, and we're looking forward to going back to normal.
With a newly approved COVID-19 vaccine available to Canadians, targeting both the original strain of coronavirus and the Omicron variant, normalcy is the hope.
It is the first bivalent COVID-19 vaccine to be authorized for use in Canada.
And a swift rollout is planned.
If we are able to hit that 80, 85, 90% of Canadians up to date in their vaccinations, we'll have a much better winter.
But before then, health experts are predicting a challenging surge in COVID-19 and other illnesses.
We look to the Southern Hemisphere almost as an imperfect gauge of what we'll see here in Canada. They had a pretty impressive influenza season down there, so COVID's unfortunately not going anywhere.
In Ontario, much looser protocols around COVID-19, with individuals who test positive no longer needing to isolate for 5 days.
We are saying stay home till your symptoms are improving, plus 24 hours.
An approach that has some physicians fearing mass spread.
If you just go after 48 hours, you're probably going to infect your classmates at school, you're going to infect your coworkers.
I don't know how I feel about it because I think we're just living with COVID right now.
It's at least a week, like a work week.
The change comes as yet another hospital, this one south of Ottawa, has shut down its ER through the Labor Day long weekend. Another signal of a healthcare system in crisis.
2 years of pressures did definitely take its toll on our nurses. You couple that with vacant positions.
With students returning to classrooms, concern is heightened. This week, Saskatchewan and Ontario announced boosters for children ages 5 to 11 who had a previous shot at least 4 months prior.
Things are going to get better, probably in the spring. We're going to have a lot more population immunity. We're going to have hybrid immunity. We have people with improved boosters, and we have a flotilla of improved vaccines coming around the corner. Intranasal vaccines, pan-coronavirus vaccines.
Meaning this could be the final challenging fall. Caryn Lieberman, Global News, Toronto.
At Europe's largest nuclear power plant, a group of UN inspectors completed their long-awaited preliminary inspection of the site. Now that after the group was repeatedly being held up by attacks in and around the Zaporizhzhia complex.
It is obvious that the plant and the physical integrity of the plant has been violated several times.
The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency says experts will remain at the facility to provide what he called an impartial assessment of the safety situation. The trip came amid another round of shelling in the region. Both Moscow and Kyiv again blamed one another for the attacks, saying they were attempts to derail the visit. And this visit comes just days after Ukraine launched a counteroffensive in the region. And while Ukrainian troops advance, there are growing concerns that some of their donated equipment doesn't meet battlefield requirements. As Jeff Semple explains in this Global News exclusive, some Canadian companies may be to blame.
Police is the last.
This truck near the Russian border in northeastern Ukraine is making a special delivery. Badly needed body armor for Ukrainian police and military volunteers, capable of stopping a Russian bullet.
And this protects all the important organs.
Yes.
On a recent visit to Ukraine, Global News met with a team responsible for testing body armor and helmets for the Ukrainian military. Much of their supply has arrived from abroad, but when they put some of those armored plates to the test, the results were shocking. The bullets blew through some plates. Others were shattered.
Nowadays we have a lot of imported vests that are penetrated because of some companies make a lot of money and they don't understand what they do.
Global News traced some of those faulty plates back to Canada.
It's heart-wrenching, right? The blood's on their hands basically with this stuff.
This Ukrainian Canadian runs a Toronto tactical equipment shop. After Russia invaded Ukraine, he says, demand for body armor soared, and the market was flooded with fakes. Items like this one purchased near Toronto claim to offer level 4 protection, the highest available, capable of stopping an armor-piercing bullet. But when we put this plate to the test, even with a weaker bullet, it failed.
This bullet went right through.
This bullet went right through, yeah, so it's through and through, so straight through there and out the back.
Another test on a second plate did not go through, but caused major damage. This Canadian veteran and former police officer says users should look for this stamp.
Very important to have this information on a plate.
Indicating a plate is NIJ certified by the American National Institute of Justice. The difference is plain to see after testing a certified NIJ Level 3 plate with an even stronger bullet.
This is going to Ukraine, and it's going to be on the front line. It's going to be used. It more than likely will be shot at. So, I mean, this is life depending.
There are lots of people who are doing war profiteering.
Back in Ukraine, Global News also saw faulty tourniquets, medical devices that apply pressure to stop life-threatening bleeds. This one, made in Canada using 3D printing technology, failed multiple tests, falling apart before sufficient pressure was applied, according to Dr. Irina Rybinkina, who tests tourniquets for the Ukrainian government.
Thinking that this could save your life is a false reassurance.
The manufacturer told Global News its products have been used successfully for years in Gaza, and it's distributing tourniquets to Ukrainian hospitals because the need is great.
Like, if it's not perfect, but they still will have something, I think that is a criminal statement, because what they've got in their hands would tear, wouldn't hold, wouldn't stop the bleeding.
There have been reports of Ukrainians killed after their body armor or tourniquets failed, though none of those items has been linked to Canada. The promise of life-saving equipment can be deadly if broken. Jeff Semple, Global News.
The chairman of Lukoil, that's Russia's largest oil company, has died under suspicious circumstances. Russia's TASS news agency says Ravil Maganov fell from the 6th-story window of a Moscow hospital. Shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, the Lukoil board publicly criticized the war and called for a ceasefire. 6 top Russian energy industry executives have now died under mysterious circumstances since the war began. Russian forces are teaming up with the militaries from China and several other nations for a week-long military exercise. Codenamed Vostok 2002, it involves units from the Russian, Chinese, and Indian armed forces, along with soldiers from Belarus, Tajikistan, Nicaragua, and Syria. Russia's defense ministry says more than 50,000 troops are involved in the maneuvers, which are being carried out in Russia's Far East and the Sea of Japan. The exercise is being seen as a sign of the increasingly strong ties between Moscow and Beijing. A long-delayed United Nations report is painting a damning picture of China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups. The document details what it calls credible evidence of torture, sexual violence, and forced sterilization, actions that may amount to crimes against humanity. But the report stops short of calling it genocide, a term Canadian and American lawmakers use to describe the treatment of Uyghurs. Redmond Shannon has more on the report and why human rights groups are upset.
For 5 years now, China's so-called vocational education and training centres have been suspected as locations of alleged human rights abuses. Accusations that up to 1 million Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in the Xinjiang region were kept inside, facing torture, sterilisation and forced labour. China has always said they are voluntary camps to tackle extremism. This United Nations report is the most high-profile investigation yet. It says China's actions may amount to crimes against humanity, and that detainees allege various forms of sexual violence, including some instances of rape affecting mainly women. Also, that there are credible indications of violations of reproductive rights through the coercive enforcement of family planning. Beijing didn't hold back, saying the outgoing UN Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet has become a thug of the West, calling the report completely illegal and invalid. Citing late interventions from China, Bachelet released the document just minutes before her 4-year term ended.
She did not have the guts to release the report earlier.
Uyghur activists like Rushan Abbas are critical of how Bachelet steered clear of the word genocide, a term lawmakers in Canada and the US are using.
They list the child abductions, forced sterilizations, and everything. The description of genocide is there.
Abbas, whose sister was detained 4 years ago once China kicked off the UN Human Rights Council, and she is joining calls for Ottawa to follow Washington on stronger trade rules to prevent the import of any goods from Xinjiang suspected to have been made with forced labour.
I cannot help but wonder when I see anything that's made in China, if my sister's blood and sweat is in that product.
The report recommends China release all detainees. That is unlikely, as any action from Beijing would only appear to be an admission of guilt. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Donald Trump's special master bid. Coming up, the former U.S. president's request in the Mar-a-Lago investigation. Plus, capturing a distant world, another NASA breakthrough courtesy of the James Webb Telescope. To Pakistan now, where months of monsoon rain has eased, but now the country's health officials are warning of waterborne diseases spreading in flood-ravaged areas. Right now, the focus is for the government to get clean drinking water to hundreds of thousands of people displaced by the disaster, which has killed almost 1,200 people since mid-June and affected 33 million. In the past 24 hours, the government reported 90,000 cases of diarrhea in the hardest-hit province. Skin diseases and eye infections are also spreading in relief camps. And UNICEF says more than 3 million children are at heightened risk of contracting diseases, drowning, and suffering malnutrition. The U.S. Justice Department and Donald Trump's legal team faced off in court today. The former president is requesting a special master to look at the classified evidence seized from his Mar-a-Lago home by the FBI. Neetu Garcha reports from Washington.
Marking the first time they've argued in court about the Mar-a-Lago search, Donald Trump's lawyers had few words for the public after the judge chose to delay the decision.
Mr. Kais, what do you think? How did it go?
Went well.
In their court filing late Wednesday, Trump's lawyers claimed the August 8th search was unnecessary and legally unsupported, adding the DOJ would impugn, leak, and publicize the material, and that the notion that presidential records would contain sensitive information should never have been cause for alarm. Then Trump's attorneys arguing in court on Wednesday keeping the classified documents is like possessing an overdue library book.
This is not a case about the Presidential Records Act. Had he complied with the multiple requests to turn back the documents, he could claim executive privilege under the Presidential Records Act. but that day is past.
The judge says a ruling will be issued later when the written order is due for the hearing on the former president's request for a special master, an independent third party, to review the highly sensitive material seized from his Florida mansion. But State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg says a special master review could put lives at risk.
The real problem is the delay in the intelligence community review of the damage that this all caused, the damage to our national security and to our human assets overseas.
But Trump's attorney so far unable to back up his claim that he declassified the documents in question.
That omission speaks loudly because his lawyers obviously know that the president doesn't have the ability to just completely declassify things.
Meanwhile, unlike his legal team outside the courthouse, Trump has been vocal on his social media platform explicitly supporting QAnon, whose followers believe satanic cannibal pedophiles secretly run the government, and showing pictures of top Democrats saying they're the enemies and demanding he be reinstated as president.
For Donald Trump, any coverage is good coverage.
Now the investigation for serious crimes that could see the former president incarcerated are not just being downplayed in public, but also before a judge. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Washington.
For the first time, astronomers captured an image of a planet outside our solar system using the new Webb Space Telescope. The images, well, they're not much to look at, but what they represent is amazing. That fuzzy dot is an infrared image of a gas giant type planet orbiting a star about 400 light years away from Earth. As the Webb telescope continues to get dialed in, we should get images of much smaller planets and in even greater detail, including those that could harbor life. Fighting for fair learning ahead is Canada's education system failing its students with disabilities. Every parent wants the best for their child, but a Newfoundland and Labrador couple are fighting for fair education. Todd and Kimberly Churchill have long been calling for their son Carter, who is deaf, to receive proper assistance in the classroom so he can get the same quality education as children with hearing. As Ross Lord reports, the province's Human Rights Commission has begun looking into the discrimination case launched against the province's English school district.
Aside from living with cerebral palsy, Carter Churchill is deaf, a condition his parents say they were assured would not diminish his education. But they say it did. They allege the Eastern School District in the St. John's area of Newfoundland and Labrador violated the Human Rights Act by providing substandard education to Carter.
He is going to grade 6 next week, and he's not able to read. He is not meeting the curriculum in his grade level.
At their human rights hearing, testimony confirmed Carter received a student assistant in kindergarten to translate for him in sign language. As it turned out, the assistant could not so much as spell out her own name, leaving Carter isolated and falling behind on his learning. The Churchills say in the past 5 years, such problems have continued. They say all they want for their son is what was promised. In 2010, Canada ratified a United Nations convention promising people with disabilities an inclusive, quality education on an equal basis with others.
When Carter is older, and we explain all this to him of all the fighting we had to do for his education, we need to be able to look him in his eyes and tell him we did the best we could.
With many so-called schools for the deaf closing across Canada in the name of inclusion and the pandemic compounding educational challenges, advocates say shortcomings are arguably more acute than ever.
I think a lot of these students are going through the education system and just being ignored. So I think there are probably a lot more stories like the Churchills that we're not even aware of.
The Churchills hope the Human Rights Commission's ruling calls out inadequate programming, spurring action that spares other families from the financial and emotional strain of fighting the system for a fair education. Ross Lord, Global News.
50 years after tragedy, next, Montreal remembers those lost to the Bluebird Cafe fire. In Montreal today, a tragic anniversary for one of the worst mass killings in Canadian history. On September 1st, 1972, after being turned away at the door, 3 men intentionally set fire to a packed downtown bar. 50 years later, Our Mike Armstrong spoke with witnesses and survivors remembering the victims of the Bluebird Cafe fire.
I was finishing my day at work.
It is a night this retired police officer has never been able to shake. 50 years ago, André Mainville turned a corner and saw, he says, a ball of fire and people in the flames.
People were falling from the second floor. They jumped from the window. I was not able to help them too much.
The Bluebird building stood on this spot in downtown Montreal. On the second floor, there was a nightclub, the Wagon Wheel. September 1st, 1972 was the Friday night of a long weekend. There was a band playing, and suddenly the drummer yelled fire.
To me, it's like a stampede. You're literally running for your life.
Brent Malfara was inside the club on that night, trying to escape what he says felt like an oven. His face was burned.
I just had third degree. It was just from the heat. And I remember the fire guys coming saying, you want to go to the hospital? I go, no. You got more important people to take care of right now.
There was just everybody in a panic.
The tragedy was remembered with a ceremony just up the street from where the bar once stood. There is today a monument to the 37 lives lost in a crime as sad as it was senseless. The fire was set by 3 men who had earlier in the night been turned away at the door. They were too drunk. Hoping to put a scare into the doorman, they returned with a plastic jug and 50 cents worth of gas. They set the staircase on fire. 2 emergency exits in the building had been blocked to keep people out. That also kept people in. The drummer who yelled fire was killed. The band's guitar player, Don Bedard, made it out after an exit door was forced open.
Somebody got on top of somebody's shoulder and broke the door, and thank God they did that, because I'd be dead.
The 3 arsonists would be sentenced to life in prison, but all were released on parole within 10 years. The loss of life led to changes in fire regulations, but for decades it was known as Montreal's forgotten tragedy. What did not feel forgotten on this day? Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And that's Global National for this Thursday night. I'm Farah Nasser. On behalf of our whole crew, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us. Tonight's your Canada. Wow, look at this photo. It's harvest in Golden Prairie, Saskatchewan. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.